The Modernization of Japan. In 1853, 4 modern American warships sailed into Tokyo Bay, Japan's great harbor. It was a show of power. Commodore Matthew Perry hoped it would force Japan to change its trading policies and allow American imports to be sold. For the previous 2 centuries, the Japanese had kept their national economy mostly closed off to foreign trade, but American businesses saw Japan, with its vast population, as a great potential market for their pots, cloth, and other goods they were now rapidly producing for distribution. It may not have been an act of war, but the sudden appearance of warships was certainly a hard sell. Did Perry's aggressive marketing work? To get an idea of how Japan responded to this forceful display, check out this Japanese poster from 1887. It teaches the Japanese versions of fashionable English words. Japan in the late 19th century was already one of the most literate societies in the world. The fact that they are now learning English reveals how quickly and intentionally they prioritize international business. The Tokugawa shogunate. So why now? Before 1868, for about 7 centuries, Japan had been under the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns. Japan did have an emperor, but his role was purely ceremonial. Shoguns were military leaders, some would say dictators, whose job was to maintain the stability of society in a certain territory. Japan's rigid class system during this era put peasants at the bottom, farmers and makers, artisans, above them, and then a class of soldiers called samurai above them. The samurai served regional lords called the daimyo. Stability was important, so the lines between classes were drawn very clearly. However, people were still able to move up and down these classes. In fact, peasants had sometimes managed to become important lords. Japanese society also had a high regard for intellectual pursuits. During this time, the country had a rich intellectual and artistic life, with new art, literature, early forms of comics, and philosophy constantly emerging. Japan had far more people who could read than most of the world's other regions at this time, so literature and poems were highly prized. However, contact with the outside world was strictly regulated. Under the Tokugawa shoguns, Europeans were only ever legally allowed to trade at one port, Nagasaki. That's another reason Perry's warships in Tokyo Bay were such a shocking sight. But Tokugawa Japan had an economic problem. The shoguns relied on taxation from agriculture to keep the country going and to stay in power. Over time, this did not produce enough money for the government, especially since the regional daimyo, lords, and samurai had to be paid. The only way to keep things going was to raise taxes on the peasants, who, as a result, were increasingly angry. This weakened the government of Japan at a critical time. When Commodore Perry tried to force Japan to do business, literally at gunpoint, Japan's leaders naturally feared a future invasion. They could also see how nearby China was being defeated and torn apart by European states that were trying to force the Chinese to buy their products, including opium. They worried, with good reason, that something similar could happen in Japan if they did not modernize. Hoping to protect Japan from a potential European threat, they began to demand military and industrial reforms in response. But these changes fed into the unrest already bubbling up within Japan from the peasants and samurai classes. The result was a period of political chaos. Many argued against copying the Europeans and Americans, wishing to preserve Japanese culture and way of life. In the mid-1860s, a brief civil war broke out, and the reformers, the ones who wanted modernization in the style of those Western nations, won and took power. They were called the Meiji.